Hey everyone, Krishna over here from CapturedLandscapes.com. Today I want to show you a really easy workflow to edit your autumn photos in Luminar 4. It's only going to take a couple minutes, but we're going to transform a relatively standard autumn shot and really make it beautiful and make those colors pop. Now, a lot of people tend to use the Vibrance, Saturation, and Contrast sliders. I'm going to completely avoid those and instead use some other more selective sliders that let us target only specific areas in the shot instead of the global image. Let's just hop straight into it and let's see what we can do. Alright, so as you can see, we have a pretty decent shot here to begin with. We've got a nice golden glow coming in from the side, a beautiful scenery, some nice colors here in the autumn trees, but it's still a little bit flat and it lacks that punch that we really want to apply to our autumn photos. So the very first step we're going to do is to correct the exposure. Now I want to avoid using the exposure slider as this will brighten or darken the entire image regardless of the current values. That means that when we're brightening or increasing the exposure, we're also brightening these areas that are already really bright, and as you can see we're starting to clip, as you can see here in the histogram as well. Instead, we're going to be working with the smart contrast, highlights, and shadow sliders, and for some images you also want to use the white and blacks. In this case, I'm going to start by increasing the smart contrast to about +20, and I'm going to also increase the shadow slider to about +25. Now, I don't want to increase the shadows too much. As you can see, increasing this all the way, even though we bring out a lot of nice details here in the foreground, it becomes really flat and it gives a type of look that I want to avoid for my own photos. I prefer having some darker areas and instead use this light to really emphasize the mountain and the beautiful light that's coming in on these trees. So we're going to go back and put this to about +25. As you can see, we're starting to bring out some of the details in the shadows here while still keeping it a little bit dark and cold. And cold is one of the things I want to keep the shadows. This is something we're going to be working on later on in this workflow. But I want to have a warm to cold balance, so that means we keep the highlights and the brighter parts of the photo warm while we're keeping the shadows nice and cold. In this image, I'm not going to be using the highlights and white slider. The reason is I already like the highlights as they are. They're a little bit bright here on the side, but that helps emphasize that side light that we're having due to the setting sun, which should be right over here. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to move on to Luminar's artificial intelligence tools. I generally tend to avoid or be very careful with these tools, as applying them at a too high rate creates this kind of grungy and overly crisp look that I want to avoid. Instead, I'm going to just use the AI accent and put it to +5, and I'm going to do the same for the AI structure. Now, as you can see, this is a very subtle change, but it has added a little bit extra crispness and it has corrected exposure just a little bit extra. We don't really need to do more than this, so we're going to move on to the color, and this is where we start seeing a big difference in the shot. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, I want to avoid using the saturation and vibrance sliders. So as you see, if I increase the saturation, I'm not only increasing the saturation of the oranges and the colors in the highlight, but I'm also increasing the greens in the foreground and the blues in the sky. For me, this looks overly saturated and it is a style that I do want to avoid. So instead, we're going to open the Advanced Setting tab and use the Hsl sliders. This lets us target specific colors in the shot, such as the reds, orange, yellows, greens, and blues, and we can then adjust the hue and saturation and luminance in them. We're going to start by adjusting the greens, and as you can see in this shot, we have some greens in the foreground as well as a little bit here in some of these trees. Now, as I said, I like to keep a cool and less saturated foreground. So I'm going to move this slightly towards the yellow just for the colors to match better with the highlights, but I'm going to reduce the saturation to make sure that it doesn't stand out or pop too much. We could have also moved this towards the blue, but as you can see, the combination with this really bluish green combined with the oranges does not really look well. So instead we're going to move it towards the yellow so we have a better color harmony with the rest of the shot. For the yellows, we're going to start by increasing the saturation, increasing the luminance, and then change the hue slightly towards orange. As you can see, this does a lot in warming up these already beautiful colors, but we want them to pop just a little bit more. We're going to do the same for the orange by increasing the saturation a little bit, dropping the hue just slightly, and then increasing that luminance. Now if we turn this on and off, you can see that we have done a lot in making these colors pop. But there's one thing that I noticed right now, and that is that the colors here in the left side are too dominant and take away a lot of the tension from the center point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mask and remove this from the photo. So as you see, I click the edit mask button, choose brush, and since we want to remove this adjustment, you have to make sure that you're on the erase. Now I just need to slightly paint over this corner. I have activated the mask so you can see that everywhere that is not red will be removed from the photo. If you look here in the color tab, you can see that we have a small black dot up on the side. And this is where this particular adjustment has been removed. Keep in mind that we're only removing the adjustment from the color tab, but the light, enhance, and structure tools are still visible throughout the image. Now we're going to move on down to the landscape enhancer. Again, this is a tool that I probably would be a little bit careful with for most photos, but when working on autumn images, it really does a nice job. You have the golden hour tool here, which helps enhance that golden hour feel that we already have by introducing a warmer tonality. But I do not recommend using this for any shot that is captured during broad daylight. It does a much better job for shots like this that are actually captured during the sunrise hours or sunset hours. Again, we're going to be careful not increasing this too much, but we're going to put it about plus 13 or plus 10 looks pretty fine. We're also going to be using the Foliage Enhancer to see if we can bring out a little bit more colors around here. So we're going to put that to a pretty shy plus 5, but we're going to change that hue towards a more orange and yellow feel. So if we drag that slider back and forth, you can see that the colors, especially here in the foreground, is changing. If we take it all the way to the right, it becomes this green color that I want to avoid. And if we take it all the way to the left, it becomes a lot more orangey. I find this a little bit too much, so I'm going to drop that Foliage Enhancer down to plus 2. But if we switch this on and off, you can see that we're already done a lot in warming up and making this a little bit more cozy. The final thing I'm going to do in the Essentials category is to add a Slight Vignette. I like adding vignettes to emphasize something in the photo. In this case, the main subject will be the mountain and this light source coming in. So I'm going to darken the corners around. I'm going to decrease the amount to minus 40. But I'm going to move the subject, which means the center point of the vignette, here to the side. So as you can see, we're not darkening anything around here, but instead darkening just the corners on the rest of the photo. I'm also going to increase the feather and the inner light slightly to make this stand out even more. Now we're going to move on to the creative category. And what I want to do here is to create this sense of like an autumn effect, a soft, nice, warm glow. In Luminar 4, you have an autumn effect tool, which is found under the portrait category. I don't really like using this one for landscapes, but they have a really nice mystical and glow tool that does a similar job. So we're going to start by the mystical. We're going to add the amount to +3. Again, you don't want to overdo this, as overdoing this creates a way too blurry and Orton effect look. So I'm going to keep that at around +4. And then the same with glow, I'm going to change the type to soft glow. Increase the amount to about 7 or 8. And I'm also going to add the warmth, or increase the warmth ever so slightly. So if we turn that on and off, you can see how we got a nice soft glow and coming in from the side here, and we warmed it up. This has done a lot in enhancing that autumn feel, and now we just have a couple more adjustments left before we're done. So we're going to hop over to the professionals category. I'm going to go to the advanced contrast tool. This is one of my absolute favorite tools in Luminar 4. I always add a midtones contrast in Photoshop. However, this means you have to create a luminosity mask, and that can get quite tricky, especially for the beginner. In Luminar 4, this is done with a single slider, and the result is pretty much the same. So we're going to hop down to this midtones contrast slider and increase that to about +25. Now the reason why you want to add contrast through the midtones instead of globally, such as through a S-curve or the contrast slider, is because a regular contrast adjustment targets the entire photo, which means that we're brightening the already brights and darkening the already darks. When you do that, it doesn't take much before you are blowing out the highlights and then at the same time underexposing the shadows and creating more harm than good. When you're using the midtones contrast, you are avoiding clipping highlights or shadows and instead applying contrast only to the tones that are neither too bright nor too dark. So as you can see, if we turn this on and off, we have added a nice contrast to the most of the landscape without affecting the highlights or the shadows. The final things we're going to do is to make that color a little bit warmer, and we're going to do that by using the Color Enhancer, Photo Filter, and Split Toning tools. Again, the Color Enhancer tool is one that I would want to be careful with. If you increase the brilliance too much, you're getting a really funky looking image, and in my eyes, this is not nice at all. So I'm going to keep this at about +2 or 3. And I'm going to move on to Photo Filter. I'm going to increase the amount quite a lot to begin with because I need to find the correct color. So this is not nearly what I want it to look like. What I want to do is I'm going to take the hue slider and move it around until I find a more yellowy orange that fits especially nice into this glowy area. So if we around here, it looks pretty good, and then I'm going to reduce the amount to about 9 or 10. So if we turn that on and off, you can see we have a really nice warm glow coming in here now. The final thing we're going to do is to enhance this glow just slightly more, add a little bit more warmth to it. We'll do that using the highlights in the split toning tool. Again, you're going to start with a way too high saturation just to find the correct color by moving the hue around. So somewhere around there looks fine, and then I'm going to drop that saturation back down to about +5. So as you can see, I'm making a lot of subtle adjustments instead of just pulling one slider all the way to the right. The reason why I'm doing this is that I get more control than if I was to just use, say, the brilliance slider or the saturation slider. We've now been able to increase the saturation of these oranges and the bright light coming aside without really affecting the cold tones a lot. So if we take a look at what we started with, you can see that we started with a pretty nice shot, but quite flat and uninteresting. And after just a few adjustments, we made that really pop and given that nice warm autumn feel that we want. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something here. I'm looking forward to seeing your autumn photos, so go out shooting and have fun.